The University of Bristol, Nick Skelton, who is now working as an independent IT consultant. He's not here to sell you anything, but if any of you are looking to talk with somebody who really knows our sector, Nick might well be your man.
Thank you. Hi everyone. This is a photo of where I started in my IT career in higher education 20 years ago. It's Hyatt Baker Hall, it's the hall of residence where I was a student and where I started through a summer job installing the ResNet service for all Bristol's halls of residence. I was clambering through the loft spaces, plugging in cables and developing DNS servers and Oracle databases and programming switches via SNMP and all the rest of it to set up what at the time was pretty much the first UK internet access service in study bedrooms. And it was great fun. And I went on from that and I was head of IT infrastructure at Bristol for a while, and then I was program director and I was looking at our move to Office 365 at Bristol, but really the people, the cultures, the behaviours, the ways of working using the technology. But I'm not really going to talk about any of that today, but I'm going to start off by sort of looking back over the last 20 years and sort of thinking how the sector has changed in that time and the sort of eras and epochs we've gone through. And then I'll try and stick my neck out a little bit and make some predictions, which is always a fun if dangerous game, as to what might be in store for us in the next 10 years, and think about the sort of skills we might need to prepare ourselves for that. So how have universities changed? I put this out on Twitter at the very start of the conference. What's the single most significant development in higher education IT in the last 20 years? I will take any last-minute nominations now. Arthur, I know you've been around as long as I have. What would you say is the most significant development, most useful or innovative or important in that time? Wi-Fi. That was one of the answers I got. One of the answers I got was EduRoam. And I think that is still something which is incredibly important. We might take it for granted now in higher education that you can turn up at any other university in the country, most other universities worldwide, and just get on the network with no faffing around, no hassle. But it's incredible. It's just starting to happen in central and local government with GovRoam, and they are going mad for it and thinking this is incredible and amazing. We did it 20 years ago. The other answer I got wasn't from an IT colleague, it was from an academic, and they said the most important thing in 20 years was I can access my electronic journals electronically. I don't have to go into the library and wade through those reams of paper. I can access that academic research anytime, any place, anywhere. And at a technology level, well, that's Open Athens and that's Shibboleth. So that's 3 federated authentication technologies, which are terribly important at a technical level and the users don't care how they work. And they're things that were developed in the sector. EduRoam was a European collaboration. Open Athens was spun out from the University of Bath, and Shibboleth came from Internet 2 in the US. And they are things that we grew ourselves. Universities have changed a lot in the last 20 years, and I think all of us now are building far less, and we are adopting more packaged solutions. And a very good reason for that, as one of the speakers from JISC was talking about earlier. But I think there is still some room for innovation and for us to build our own stuff in the right environment. We make much better use of the big global IT suppliers than we used to, and we need to build up the relationship with them and work out what we get them to do and what's left for us to do ourselves, and that is constantly changing. Looking back, this is incredibly simplistic, but that's what you do when you look back and you try and put things into neat little packages and eras. I think there's been 3 main eras since universities first went on the internet. So anybody know when the first TCP/IP service on Janet was? Oh, too far. First, it was 1991 was the first IP traffic on Janet. And I call the 90s the Friends era. This was the time at which we were all friends because Universities were just about the only people on the internet at that point. So we didn't really worry about what we were putting out there. We were running all sorts of horribly insecure protocols like NFS and SMB, and we didn't really have a firewall. Or if we did have a firewall, it didn't block a lot. And at that stage, you could kind of get away with it, because we were all friends. We were all universities that were supporting each other, and there wasn't much out there to worry about. So that worked really well for a while. But then things started to change. And the next era, the 2000s, it was 2000 that the first real sort of internet worm started. It wasn't the first. But when you got one, and then another one a month later, and another one 3 months later, and it was the era of Windows XP, and everything was horribly insecure. And we had to change. So we put up moats, we put up drawbridges, we started to protect ourselves, and we sort of retreated inwards into ourselves as universities. And we thought, if only we can put some big barrier between us and the rest of the world, we will keep our universities safe. And that was the sort of mindset we were operating in for a while. And that sort of worked for a while. It wasn't very convenient, but it became less and less convenient as time went on, and then we moved through to the 2000s. And the 2000s I'd call the edgeless era, or the everywhere era, or the cloud era. So at this point, we can't protect our stuff because our stuff is everywhere. We have infrastructure in-house, we have infrastructure in the cloud, we have staff working on-premise, we have staff working globally anywhere, and they need to access their stuff, as do our students. So that old idea of you draw up the drawbridge and you protect the university just doesn't work any longer. This book is about 10 years old. It's still available as a PDF. It's on JISC and Demos, and it's about how universities might change in the era of anywhere, everywhere computing. And it's still a good read to think about how universities might change in that environment. But we tried to protect stuff. It's just what we protected changed. So rather than putting that barrier around the whole of the university, we thought we'd protect our crown jewels. We'd work out what the most important thing in the university was, what is our most important research data probably, and we would protect that. And we probably still haven't caught up with where we need to be for that era. So we should probably all be using multi-factor authentication, and I suspect we're not. Any show of hands, how many institutions are using MFA? So that's, yeah, and a few wavering, half if we're being generous. But that's sort of what we need for now. What do we need for the next 10 years? I'll come on to that. Going back to 2010, 2011 was when I introduced Google Apps into University of Bristol. And I had lots of quite deep discussions with lawyers, with academic researchers, with the information security people within IT services about what this meant, and could we do it, and should we do it, and was it a good idea? And the philosophy came down to sort of trust or control. So when we ran all our own infrastructure, we thought, well, we know what we're doing. We're in charge. We are good people. It'll be okay because we are knowledgeable, good people. And so that will be sufficient. When we started moving to a cloud era, we started having to answer questions like, is it still okay? And the answer to that was, yes, but only because we trust the people we're working with. And some people didn't trust Google, or Amazon, or Microsoft. And it was really a political argument and not a technical one. And we had to sort of think about, who do we want to work with? We might trust some people and not others. And that came down to factors like, do they know what they're doing? What resources do they have? Are they accredited and inspected? Are they on a framework agreement that somebody else has looked at and said that these are good people to work with and they've done that due diligence for us? And the answers started to get quite embarrassing because ultimately it comes down to things like Google or Microsoft have got far more resources to spend on security than we have. Their reputations are on the line. They actually will do a better job of looking after their data than we will. And we have this contract with them, which we have negotiated, and it says what they can and can't do. And most of the people in this room are, if not everybody in this room, is now very happy with an era of cloud infrastructure. But you might still find people back at your institution who are not. And explaining to them why that is okay can be difficult. But it comes down to where on that seesaw. Are you the sort of person who trusts, or are you the sort of person who wants to control it? And that changes over time. Universities used to think about people being either inside the tent or outside the tent. So within the tent you might have your staff and students, and they are in your identity management system, they are your users. They get a username, they get a password, they can access loads of stuff. And if you are outside the tent, then life is rather difficult. And we make a right mess and muddle of this. And if we want to collaborate with someone who is not inside the tent, we do all sorts of awkward things which are not very user-friendly, or we create them a registration in the database and pretend that they're honorary staff even though we don't pay them anything. And that's the model we used to use back for the last 10 or 20 years. But that idea of who is inside and who is outside the tent doesn't really work any longer, because we need to work with people who are outside the tent. They're suddenly really important to us. So our prospective students, we might want to give them a digital glimpse of what life at the university might be like, and how do we do that? We need a completely different way of thinking about things like bring your own identity. And that's not something most people do. So really the whole metaphor has collapsed. It's not helpful to think about who's inside and who's outside the tent. We need that sort of edgeless view of our users, just as we have an edgeless view of our infrastructure. So, my prediction for the next 10 years, if we've gone through the era of friends, we've gone through the era of castles, and we've gone through the era of the cloud, my next prediction is that we're entering the era of sharing. But what we're doing is we're going to be sharing our data. So we've got beyond the sort of hug it close on the infrastructure, but we still like to hug our data close. We still like to say that our data is our crown jewels and only we are trusted to access it. We must control our data. But that is starting to change. So JISC are building national data sharing platforms for research and for student data analytics. We are starting to think that if we combine our data sources, we can do more with them. The 9/11 Commission that investigated 9/11 came to the conclusion that the US government might have been able to prevent the tragedy in the two Twin Towers if the FBI and the CIA and the various other government agencies had cooperated and shared the intelligence that they already had. But they didn't. If you look at perhaps the biggest social problem in the UK at the moment, it's around social care for older people, and that is ultimately a lot of that's about data sharing between hospitals and local authorities who are responsible for social care, who in some parts of the country, including Bristol, they have some very innovative data sharing agreements where the local authority and the hospitals share data and trust each other with that, and it's a huge help in getting people out of hospital and back to be cared for in their own homes. So my prediction is that we need to be thinking about both the technologies and the sort of leadership qualities that we need for a world in which we are sharing data much more openly as the next 10 years develop. We're very lucky in higher education. We have an incredibly rich set of data sources. We've got a Higher Education Statistics Agency, HESA, little known, much overlooked, incredibly rich data sets. If you want to know who has the largest lake on university campuses nationwide, you will find that somewhere in the HESA data sets. I think it's really interesting that JISC and HESA are merging, bringing together a set of people who understand the technology and a set of people who understand the data into one organisation. So, can we change our philosophy on information security and data protection? My idea here is that we need to move away from a world where we think first, what does the law say? What does the law tell us we must do? And move to a world in which our first question is an ethical one. What is the right thing to do? So if you think about equality, diversity in universities, we used to go on courses where we were taught that the Equalities Act says you must not do this and you must do the other. And we had all sorts of little anecdotes about that. I think we've left that world some way behind. There's a lot more to do on equality and diversity, but people don't think of it as a legal issue anymore. They think of it as a social and a moral one. Data protection, we still tend to start about what does the law say? And if you ask that as the first question, you can tie yourself in knots and end up in very unfortunate situations. So Bristol and Dewey have both had a number of student suicides, quite tragically, in the last few years. And one of the questions which parents ask after that is, if somebody in the university knew that my child was struggling, why did nobody tell me? I'm their parent. And it drives me completely bonkers when people say we can't do that because of data protection. So back 20 years ago, when I was starting out my IT career, I was a student, and then I was a member of staff in pastoral care in that hall of residence at Baker I showed you earlier. And back then, probably the hall warden would have discreetly tipped off the parents, even if they knew that possibly they weren't supposed to. And that was probably the right thing to do. So Bristol now have reinvented that. Effectively, they get students to give permission when they arrive in Freshers' Week at the start that their parents can be contacted if the circumstances arise. So the law, you can find a way to comply with the law as long as you're asking the right ethical question to start with. This report here is from a think tank called Everyone, which was set up by Martha Lane Fox as a think tank looking at the implications and ethics of technology. It's just a very short methodology, a set of questions you can ask yourselves if you're introducing a new technology or building a new product in your organisation, to think, what are the consequences, does this fit with the ethics of our organisation? So we tend to write things like privacy impact assessments, and that's probably somewhere in your go live checklist for a new service. I'd like something like the consequence scanning reports to be in your go live checklist. Think about the broader ethical implications of what you're doing and not just the data protection. So, what skills might we need for the next 10 years if we're thinking about these sorts of issues? So from a technology level, I think it comes down to identity management, authentication, federation, the sorts of things that Tim Purkis from University of London was talking about yesterday. Now that is probably not the first thing we think about today when we think about the infrastructure division within an IT department. And obviously we're going to need storage, we're going to need networking, we're going to need all of that. But I reckon it's this sort of identity management layer which is where an infrastructure group is really going to deliver that value and distinguish itself and help its university. Because it's about people and it's about collaboration. And if you can get those services right, then we can build the next version of EduRoam or Open Athens, or you can take part in a national platform that JISC is building for you. You can do things like student electoral registration. If you haven't seen the JISC service for student electoral registration, where students can be enrolled on the electoral register in a very easy way via JISC in your institution, check it out. It's really useful stuff. And if we've got those sorts of systems, you can take part in whatever national platforms are built, and you can work in a multi-cloud world where you've got multiple cloud services from a large number of different vendors. What leadership skills might we need for the 2020s? So, I think it comes down to collaboration. Collaboration's a bit of an ugly word at the moment. It's used as an insult in Parliament. I'm rather keen on collaboration. I like to be thought of as a collaborator. Skills on negotiation, building trust, building relationships. These are the sorts of things I think we need more of. Supplier management, I think as a sector we tend to be quite bad at working with suppliers. Again, we tend to think of it as a legalistic thing. How do we do a procurement such that nobody's going to sue us? Actually, we need to be working very closely with our suppliers. We need to be looking for the win-wins, not trying to beat them down on cost and forget about everything else. We need to be building up that trust, working in an ethical way and looking for a long-term relationship. So what can I do as an individual? So you've probably heard of the idea of T-shaped individuals. T-shaped individuals have depth in a particular technical area, but they have breadth and are interested in a large variety of other things. And they've got that desire and the ability to make those connections. So within universities, look at the university. If you're new into the sector, look at things like the Times Higher, Wonky. Who's heard of wonche.com? We've got 1, 2, 4, 6, 7, 8 hands in the room. Check it out, subscribe to their weekly newsletter, find out the policy issues that are keeping Pro-Vice Chancellors and people awake at night. Think about that. We all think about the National Student Survey, I'm sure, but your institution may well run other student surveys, things like the International Student Barometer that look in much more depth. Look at those and think, how can I improve my IT to actually help students? A question I like to ask is, what would I be doing if I was in my boss's job or my boss's boss's job? And when I'm line managing someone, I like to ask them, what would you do differently if you were in my job? Always try and think about that bigger picture. And my main suggestion or plea is get out of your niche and volunteer for something else. So that could be, say, volunteering to be a committee member on one of the UCISA groups, which is a fantastic thing to do. Or in my case, it was volunteering as the co-chair of the staff LGBT+ network at University of Bristol, which got me working with a whole range of different people across the university who had no interest in technology, but I learned so much from doing that. And to finish, what can we do as a sector? Or you could entitle this, what can UCISA do for us? Or what can we all do? Because we are all UCISA, as I think we said at the start of the conference. So, UCISA and all of us can think about getting out of silos, joining us up more. So, build bridges. We had a fantastic set of conferences a few years ago on estates and IT working together. We could do that for library and IT, for marketing and IT, for many of the professional services. Let's work much more closely with our suppliers. So user groups with customers and suppliers sitting around the table, agreeing the agenda jointly and working on that. And promote common standards across universities. Sometimes things just work better if we make the same technical choice. And I mentioned this at JISCnet workshop last year. If you're deploying Office 365, think very carefully about what you make the UPN, what students use. I've got 1 or 2 smiles in the room on this. Do you log into Office 365 as username at institution or email address at institution? Because half of us choose username, half of us choose email address. The best answer is email address, because that's what people know. But if we all did it the same way, life would be so much simpler. So that's it. That is my plea for us to work together, to collaborate, to build relationships, and work more closely. And I have a few minutes, just I think, for questions. But if you want to talk to me about any of this another time, please do get in touch, and I would love to help. Thank you.
Have we got any questions for Nick? Or is everybody feeling a little tired? I think possibly, but yeah, the UPN question was very relevant to us. We chose email address, and it's a really great thing. The challenge comes from now trying to get every one of our other systems to use the same thing. So we've got plenty of work to do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.